Ladies and gentlemen, may I welcome you to this Adam Smith Institute panel discussion on drug policy. My name is Eamon Butler and I'm director of the Adam Smith Institute, which is a free market think tank, although many people say we've gone septic. But part of our role is to introduce ideas into public policy, and one of the most interesting ideas being rather on the libertarian side as we are, is drug legalization, or at least decriminalization. If you have a mobile phone on you, could you switch it to silent now so that we can proceed without interruption? The format is that we have a panel of 3 speakers. They're going to speak for 10 minutes each, and I have my little iPhone timer here. You know, last time I looked, there were 1/3 applications for the iPhone. It's because it's all free enterprise. It's done by regular guys. If there was a sort of ministry of iPhone applications, we'd still be waiting for the first one. But they're going to speak for 10 minutes each, and then we will have half an hour for questions and discussion. And after that, I hope you would join us for a closing drink at the back afterwards, before we make our way sometime after 8 o'clock. We have one substitution today. Baroness Meacher can't make it because she has laryngitis, but I'm very pleased to say that Chris Snowden has stepped in at the last minute, so we're very grateful to that. Our 3 speakers, I'll just introduce them now to save any delays, are firstly Sir Simon Jenkins. He is chairman of what Sir Francis Dashwood once called that bloody National Trust. And he currently writes columns in The Guardian and in the Evening Standard. He's formerly been editor of The Times, and appointed a Knight Bachelor for services to journalism in 2004. He's a staunch critic of government drugs policy and its war on drugs, arguing that politicians are gripped by a fear of legislation, and he's going to be debating this at the weekend with Peter Hitchens. Niamh, yeah, right, that should be amusing. Niamh Eastwood is currently the executive director of Release, which is an organisation dedicated to changing UK drugs policy. Having worked in drugs policy for the last 10 years, she's passionate about reform and believes that it's the most vulnerable in society who are disproportionately affected by the current laws. She has contributed to many publications on the subject, including Drugs and Alcohol Today and Drinks and Drugs News, as well as authoring and editing a number of Release's own publications on things like drugs and the law and sex workers and the law. Christopher Snowden is the director of the Lifestyle Freedom Unit at our friends, the Institute of Economic Affairs, as well as being an author and freelance journalist who writes for Spiked and other publications. He again is a vocal opponent of government intervention in matters such as alcohol, the obesity debate, and so on, and the assault on smoking as well. In his role at the Institute of Economic Affairs, he's written and spoken about the need for alternative drug policy and a robust defence of personal liberty. And he's also contributed to reports by the Adam Smith Institute, including the wages of sin taxes. So that's our panel. We're going to start with 10 minutes each, and then it's questions and discussions. So I'd like to welcome, please, Sir Simon Jenkins.
Thank you very much indeed, Eamon. I've addressed drugs meetings more than I care to recollect, and I stopped doing so 2 or 3 years ago out of sheer desperation. There was no further point. most of them are composed of people who are either drug addicts or drug enthusiasts. They just wanted to hear that their stuff was just fine. I don't think it's just fine, and the reason why I'm here today is it's so nice to address an audience which I take to be of the free market libertarian. I won't say right, because it's different from the audiences I used to address on this subject. I have to say it's very nice to sit and be speaking in front of a picture of a well-known drug addict on my left there. Great good fortune that his particular addiction was legal. But the committee on which I served about 7 years ago, the Runciman Committee on the Misuse of Drugs Act, was my last sort of hurrah on this subject, because it was an occasion when absolutely nothing you heard suggested that there should be government control of these substances. I'm not one of those who think that drugs are in any sense safe or a good thing. I'm totally opposed to them. I'm opposed to them. I've never taken them myself, although there were times in the Runciman Committee where we thought we ought to go off on a sort of bender, just to learn what on earth it was all about. But better off or worse, we didn't. The one I really wanted to try, I have to say, was heroin. Then I had my appendix out once. I had some, and it was the most wonderful experience I've ever had. And on the second night, I demanded some more, and they refused to give it to me. And I asserted my rights under the NHS and was still denied it. But it's silly in a sense not to understand what it is that vast numbers of people worldwide derive from these substances, however harmful they clearly, in my view, are. Because if you don't, you can't understand why, A, they should be banned, or secondly, why banning them is ineffective. I mean, these two things are separate, but they are a part of the issue. Anyway, I mean, the cut a long story short, and I imagine you're going to hear much the same from my fellow panelists. It's like a pity that we aren't going to strongly disagree. But there's no question that these, the banning of these substances, and I used to, my first job as a journalist was to cover the queue at Boots at midnight. This was in the early 70s in Piccadilly, where the heroin addicts of London gathered to collect their new supplies at midnight. And it was a tragic queue of about 60 people. And there was a vicar of the queue. I've actually forgotten his name now, but he's written books on drugs. And he tended to the queue, and he had all their names. These people were under treatment. The situation with heroin then was controllable. In 73-4 it was banned, and it went underground, and it was catastrophe. It was about as clear an illustration of the disaster of intervention in a market as you could possibly have had. But over the years since then, when I've watched the evolution of this particular control mechanism, you just do see the degree to which it's now corrupted and polluted the criminal justice system past him. Some half of the people in prison are in some sense there because of drugs. The cost to society of the illegality of the drugs is astronomical. The cost to society of failing to regulate the drugs market is astronomical. This is not a regulated market, it's a banned market, something quite different. I've got no question in my mind at all it should be a regulated market, but it should not be banned. If you ban something, it's like banning petrol. They will find it. People will find these substances. They do find these substances. The great fear, particularly applying to parents of teenage children, which I've been myself, the great fear is that if something is in some sense legalized, it'll be more available, is crass. It couldn't be more available than it is now. Not just cannabis, but strains of strong cannabis, cocaine, strains of strong cocaine, and pills galore are all over the place. And I won't pretend I can go out of this door and find some, because I haven't tried. But I know from my children, there is no problem about finding this stuff. It doesn't work to ban it. The consequence of banning it is simply to make a large number of people criminals who, for reasons you'd have thought deterrence would have worked, are basically not criminal sorts of people. If you lift your eyes from the national picture to the international picture, it is truly awful. We're fighting a war in Afghanistan, essentially over drugs. Whole states in South America are destroyed internally because of the criminalization of drugs. America's refusal to decriminalize cocaine effectively dominates the economy of Central America. American fleets are floating around the Caribbean trying to stop the trade in drugs. It's complete madness. And the test of this is that almost everybody who studies this subject in office, however you define in office, and comes out of office and starts talking on the circuit like this about the subject, says the same thing. It was madness. Almost every ex-president of Latin America now has joined up for the coalition against the illegality of drugs. It is universal now that most people who are involved in the regulation of this market, when they stop regulating the market, regard the regulation of the market as crazy. You've got the most bizarre set of circumstances here. You've got a large number of people supposedly doing something which they know at the time and subsequently admit is a failure. The war on drugs has failed. Now, the only last thing that interests me is not this. I know very few sane, sensible, balanced people who honestly don't agree with this point of view. I mean, there may be some in the room, we may hear from them, but broadly speaking, honestly, that generalization is the case. The one thing that fascinates me is why is the conventional wisdom now about the illegality of drugs completely ineffective on power? It gets absolutely no traction at all. And I watched very carefully the response to the Runciman report on drugs, which we did, which was, I thought, a sane, sensible way not to legalization, but to decriminalization, which was a pretty half-hearted, halfway house. And it was abundantly clear that the document we produced was greeted in advance with terror by ministers. Alistair Campbell told Jack Straw to write an article in the News of the World in advance of the appearance of our report, rubbishing it. We went to great care in advance of publishing the report, firstly to get opinion polls. The opinion polls, broadly speaking, were quite liberal. My use of the word liberal. The Daily Mail said this is a reasonable report and should be considered. The Sun and the News of the World said much the same thing. Shocked with Alistair Campbell to discover that the right-wing press was broadly speaking in favour of being reasonable about drugs, he demanded Jack Straw write another article saying it wasn't such a bad idea after all. The cynicism and the terror that surrounded the subject was complete. One Commons Lords report after another has suggested this ought to be considered. It never gets done. I think the reason is chiefly, I have to say, because of my own profession. I think there's a dread among politicians of incurring the wrath of the press. I may say not just in this subject, but in almost any other subject at the moment. And I think it's a real problem. It's a problem that at Runciman we went to some lengths. We took Paul Dacre out to lunch. We did all kinds of things you're supposed to do if you're going to butter up the press. And broadly speaking, we won on that front. But the terror of what the press might say was too much for the Home Office ministers at the time. But I think, I mean, the reason why I sort of stopped talking on this subject is there is no point in discussing drugs anymore. Discuss the politics of drugs. It's why is it that almost all leaders in Latin America now know something's wrong but can't do anything about it? Why is it that a large number of people in America, including a very large number of people on the right, the libertarian right, think we've got to go on this route, and yet they can't? Although, interestingly, America is the country in the world now which is in the forefront of legalization. I mean, the last batch of elections really did show that, at least as far as cannabis is concerned, the walls are tumbling down. And I still believe America will be the most advanced country on this sometime in the future. But broadly speaking, the question to ask is simply not what is the right thing to do, but why is it we can't do it? Let's discuss that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon. Your point about how nice heroin is not lost on me. Not that I've had it myself, but my history professor had it and said how wonderful it was. And it did strike me that we keep telling our kids that drugs are very bad for them and they must avoid them. What we don't tell them is how nice they are. And so when they do take them, they're not prepared for that. Anyway, Neely.
Thank you, Eamon, and thank you to the Adam Smith Institute for the invitation to talk this evening. I have to say I'm slightly more optimistic than maybe Simon is about the drugs and politics, and I think things have moved on quickly in the last couple of years. But I'm going to talk about decriminalisation, and to some extent Simon is right that it is a halfway house. But I wanted to frame first of all why Release is advocating for decriminalisation in the UK. And it very much comes within the policing and prosecution of such offences, of drug possession offences. So we look just firstly at the policing of drug possession. Of stop and searches, there's 1.2 million reasonable suspicion stop and searches, and that's where the drugs law falls within it. Annually, 50% of these searches are for drugs. In London alone, over 250,000 people were stopped last year for drugs. There was a 7% arrest rate. So it's kind of like that type of fishing where they just throw dynamite in the water and hope it rises to the surface. But what is most worrying about it is the disproportionate impact it has on people of BME communities. It's really the policing of drugs that drives the racial disparity that exists in our criminal justice system. So some research from Alex Stevens at Kent University has shown that if you are black, you are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched. You're 6 times more likely to be arrested for a drugs offence, and you're 11 times more likely to go to prison than those from the white community. And that's despite the fact that drug use is actually lower in the black community than the white community, and drug dealing there's very little evidence on this. It's either comparable or lower, depending on the 2 reports that you look at in this. And we need to address this problem, because that kind of racial disparity that exists is what drives some of the unrest that we've seen over the last few decades, when we see things like the August 2011 riots, when we know that the Scarman report and the Macpherson report have identified stop and search as a real driver for unrest. And certainly, as I said, drugs is part of that narrative, and Release is currently working on a second report to support our campaign, looking at in more detail how the racial disparity exists at every point within the criminal justice system. Added to that, it's the type of policing that occurs. It's not just that we've got really high rates of stop and search and it impacts disproportionately on certain communities within our society, but it's also the interventions that police use. So imagine it, Friday night, Soho, sniffer dogs out. I mean, they're actually actively going out to find small amounts of cannabis or other drugs. People who are indicated by these dogs, and I'd like to say the dogs are wrong 76% of the time, are then subject to huge humiliation through things like strip searches. So we've had a client who was in Soho, indicated by the dog, taken to a tent, strip searched. He had no drugs on him. He was humiliated. He was devastated by this interference by the state to police what is a very low-level crime, if you want to call it that, but activity. And then the likes of Peter Hitchens, and this may help on the weekend, the likes of Peter Hitchens will argue that we aren't tough enough with our drug laws. Well, he should have that conversation with the 80,000 people a year who are prosecuted or who receive cautions for drug possession offences. And these are people who end up stigmatised as a result of it, who end up with criminal records that impact on employment, on educational aspiration, on simple things like being able to travel to the US if you can afford to do so. And well over 50% of those 80,000 criminal records is for cannabis. So the greatest risk to those who use drugs is the risk of criminalisation. And the way that we are dealing with it is not effective. And these are the reasons why we are currently advocating for decriminalisation of drug possession in the UK. What we mean by decriminalisation, so essentially it's the application of either non-criminal sanctions for possession of drugs, so it's a civil system, civil fines like parking fines or other alternatives that the state can use, or it's a decision to take no action. So in the Netherlands, for example, if you're caught in possession of drugs below a certain threshold, no action is taken, the drugs are seized. In Belgium, where they have decriminalised cannabis, no action is taken and you can keep your drugs. Very nice of the Belgians. We produced a report last year. It looked at 21 jurisdictions around the world that had adopted some form of decriminalisation of drugs, either all drugs or just cannabis. And what we wanted to do was to look at the impact that it had on prevalence rates. So the argument endlessly from those who are against any kind of reform, even decriminalisation, which I would argue is the softest type of reform, is that prevalence will explode. Simon's right, it's already available, drugs are readily available. And equally too, if non-problematic drug use increases, is that really a problem for us? If we look at people moving to cannabis use as opposed to alcohol use, is that a problem? There is possible benefits in terms of public health from taking that approach. But we wanted to show, or we wanted to see whether prevalence rates were affected. And surprise, surprise, they weren't. So overwhelmingly, countries that had adopted either non-criminal sanctions or had decided not to police the offence, drug prevalence rates did not increase after the introduction of the law, nor were they in any way statistically significantly higher than neighbouring countries in the region. And it wasn't just our report that said this. So the European Monitoring Centre on Drug and Drug Abuse has in its annual report identified that the cannabis laws adopted by various European countries, and I said some adopt a decriminalisation approach, some a harsh criminal justice model, has no impact on prevalence rates. And the UK has some of the highest rates, and we take some of the most tough enforcement approaches in Europe. So some of the countries we looked at, just to highlight the main headlines of the report. Portugal is well trotted out in this conversation about decriminalisation, but just some of the positive outcomes in Portugal. They adopted decriminalisation in 2001. Overall, drug use did increase. It increased to a very small level, but that was very common for the whole region at the time, and common in terms of patterns of drug use within Europe. Importantly, problematic drug use fell. The levels of drug use amongst young people under the age of 19 fell. HIV transmission rates reduced significantly. Treatment access rates increased significantly. The lack of, and it's been shown in some reports around this, that the lack of stigmatization that had developed as a result of a non-criminal approach encouraged people to seek out treatment where it was appropriate for them to do so. And it was a reduced burden on the criminal justice system. The Czech Republic adopted decriminalisation of drug possession offences in 2010. They did this as a result of a cost-benefit analysis that they carried out in 2002, where they looked at whether the criminal laws that they had any impact on prevalence, purity or price. They found it didn't, and so they were brave enough to take another option. The Netherlands adopted decriminalisation in 1976, although technically on the statute books it's still a criminal offence. It's the police and prosecutorial guidelines that mean that those laws aren't enforced. And again, they have good outcomes in terms of problematic use. Low levels of problematic use, low levels of injecting use, and low levels of young people who become problematic drug users. The economic argument in the US, California, a number of states in the US actually started decriminalising cannabis possession back in the 70s. There was a whole wave of states in the region of about 8 or 9. And California did this in 1976. And when they did it, the total cost of enforcement for cannabis offences declined from $17.7 million in the first half of 1975 to $4.4 million in the first half of 1976, a saving of over $13 million in the 70s. So why does Release advocate for decriminalisation? It is no panacea to the problem. Simon's highlighted some of the international problems. Decriminalisation does not deal in any way with the supply side issue and all the associated harms that are linked to it, including the nearly 60,000 or over 60,000 now people dead in Mexico, the destabilisation of states such as Guinea-Bissau in West Africa, which is a direct result of a tightening up of the trade in Latin America, just pushing it over to Western Africa, where we will see huge damage to those countries. And we've handed over a trade estimated anywhere between 300 billion to 500 billion annually to organised crime. Well, the reason we advocate for decriminalisation is that in the UK, politicians are still wary of the subject. And we believe that in terms of the international evidence and also in relation to the growing call for reform internationally, that decriminalisation is an easier policy ask for politicians. More importantly, the countries that we looked at in our report had adopted decriminalisation, had gone on to take quite progressive steps towards regulation. So if you like, it's incremental policy change. So if we look at, for example, the Netherlands, de facto decriminalisation in the mid-70s, cannabis coffee shops in the 80s. We have Spain, de facto decriminalisation in the 1990s. We now have a huge explosion of cannabis social clubs where there's a quasi-legal system for cannabis sales and supply. Uruguay, a country that has never criminalised possession of drugs, is now moving to the first national regulated model of cannabis where supply, possession and production will be legal. And Washington and Colorado, the two states that have just voted for a regulatory model for cannabis, all had decriminalisation first and then moved to medical marijuana. So we really see this as a step towards incremental change, and that's why we're advocating for decriminalisation. So thank you.
Is your report online?
Oh, the report's online. Downloaded 100,000 times, just want to say. I'm happy to send out copies to anyone who wants any. Please email in the plug card.
Thank you. And Chris Snowdon, as I say, we're very grateful to Chris for stepping in at very short notice.
My pleasure. And I said to myself when I saw who else was on the panel that I would try and disagree whenever possible, because I do hate a panel discussion where everybody completely agrees with each other. I think I've found one point of contention, which is the assertion that effectively the drug market in this country is already saturated, and if drugs were legal, there wouldn't be any increase in prevalence. I think this is very unlikely. I don't know what my other two panelists have in mind in terms of exactly what the nuts and bolts of legalisation would involve. For me, it would basically involve being able to buy drugs over the counter without a prescription, including having industries producing these things and possibly marketing them to some extent. I find it unlikely in that eventuality that there wouldn't be any increase in prevalence. I think the proportion of the population who've taken heroin at all in the last year is about 0.5%. The proportion that taken crystal meth is virtually zero, because it's not really a drug we have in this country. I suspect that if it was available in some kind of retail environment, that prevalence would go up. But as Niamh says, that's not really the issue. The principle of harm reduction, and legalisation is the ultimate in harm reduction when it comes to drugs, because as has already been noted, it's the prohibition that causes most of the problems. The principle of harm reduction is you might have more people taking the drug, but you're having fewer people die. And what Peter Hitchen's argument is essentially that if we enforce the drug laws more, there would be fewer people taking drugs, and therefore by association there would be fewer people dying. I mean, his argument, I by no means want to try him in his absence, but I think it's accurate to say his argument is that we effectively already have legalisation in this country because there's not as many people being sent to prison for taking and buying cannabis as there could be, and that I think is true. Despite everything that Niamh mentioned going on in London, we could always prosecute the war on drugs more vigorously. He therefore says that if anything that someone like me says about the harms of prohibition cannot be. They must be an illusion because we don't have prohibition. The logical fault, I think, in that argument is that even if we did have what he says we do, which is effectively decriminalisation, it would not be legalisation anyway. And since I suggest that the harms of prohibition are mainly in terms of gang warfare and thousands of people dying in South American countries and all the things that go along with that, the fact that people might sometimes get a slap on the wrist for taking or buying cannabis is largely irrelevant. Nonetheless, he does believe that more punishment means lower prevalence and therefore fewer people dying. And this is a basic prohibitionist view, going back hundreds of years. The idealist view versus the pragmatist view. As the economist Thomas Sowell says, he thinks that people can be split between people who have the vision of the anointed and the tragic vision of humanity. The vision of the anointed being people who essentially see solutions and believe that man is born perfect and is dragged down by institutions and industry. On the other hand, there are people who have the tragic vision who see that there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And prohibition and the war on drugs are classic solutions given by idealists. But I challenge the idea that idealist is even the right word, because it implies that a life of abstinence is ideal. And for some people that may be the case. But actually intoxication and the taking and seeking out of stimulants and mind-altering chemicals in various forms is, I would say, perfectly natural. It's certainly been around for long enough. You can even see it in some species of animals. There is nothing necessarily bad about drugs. Drugs are neither good nor bad. They can be good and they can be bad, depending on how they're used. And the harms of prohibition don't come largely from the drugs themselves, but from the delivery devices that are used for them. And perhaps if I can try and find another bone of contention, often the argument for liberalisation is made in terms of public health, is made in terms of the fact that fewer people will die with a legal or at least decriminalised drug market than in the current illegal market. And I do think this is almost certainly true. But I would then lay down two questions, which is, if hypothetically, if the drugs war could succeed, and drugs could be suppressed to an almost universal degree, would the war on drugs therefore be justified? And if by the same token, if more people ended up dying as a result of legalisation, would returning to the war on drugs be justified? Or to put it a third way, if we could somehow release biological war on the seeds of these plants, if we could wipe out the opium poppy and indeed the tobacco plant, would it be justified in doing that? I would say actually no to all of those. I think that if drugs went around, we would actually need to invent them. And indeed we are inventing them at a rate of about one a week in the EU at the moment as a result of trying to find loopholes through the legal high laws. Prohibition is wrong as it happens on pragmatic grounds. It does kill more people than I think would die under a legal system. But that is a bonus. Prohibition is wrong, the war on drugs is wrong, primarily because your body is your own. The fact that the free market would probably produce better outcomes is no great surprise, because that's generally what free markets do, but that is a handy bonus. The real argument, in my view, is that what you choose to eat, drink or smoke is your business and your business alone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm sure the racing cycle fraternity is inventing much more than one new drug a week, but there we go. Any other comments anybody wants to make before we move to questions? No, in that case, we've got half an hour or so for questions and discussion. We don't, of course, believe in regulation at the Adam Smith Institute, but even we have some regulations, which is that short questions or short points only, please, and only one, please. Anybody who stands up and says, well, I've got 6 questions, won't be invited back. Gentleman there, and could you give your name and where you come from?
Just a quick one for the... sorry, just a very, very quick question regarding the aspect of prevalence. Your actually consideration of the actual studies. Did you look at substitution? In other words, if the price goes up, what is the impact on a movement from one drug to another one? I mean, for example, you talk about, you don't think that, you think that probably the prevalence of drug use will actually increase, but would there not be possibly a substitution from one drug like alcohol to cannabis, for example?
Yes, I do, and I think that's a real benefit of legalisation, which isn't often made. I think there are a lot of people who would benefit from smoking opium or smoking cannabis rather than drinking alcohol. In fact, I know people who are notoriously aggressive and violent and unpleasant when drunk, and who, as a consequence, smoke cannabis on a daily or almost daily basis and are better for it. So actually, I think a lot of the discussion we have about alcohol, obviously the minimum pricing thing has been thrown out, hopefully. I think part of alcohol harm reduction is getting people onto better drugs, onto more sedate drugs, because, like I say, I think the desire for intoxication is perfectly natural. It's just at the moment we don't have enough choice in the market for people who want to get intoxicated.
Can I just
yes, go on. Yes, go on.
Just to completely agree with what Jonathan just said. I mean, there's studies from the US at the minute where they're using cannabis as a substitute for alcoholics, and they're getting good outcomes. And what's beautiful about cannabis is you can choose the routes of administration, so you can actually use it in a way that is much more safe for the internal organs of the body. So, you know, not only can it reduce the harms of one substance, it can actually significantly reduce the harm of that substance itself by not using tobacco.
And raise your appetite for cigarettes.
Yeah, but I just would like to ask the panelists that if, I mean, look at the American prohibition in the 20s. I'm sure that after the law was repealed, people probably drank a lot more. There'd be probably more alcoholism and more problems. Would you still be in favour of deregulating or legalising?
Well, I agree with the general tenor of this. I mean, I don't think you're going to be able to cure this argument by saying there's going to be a few more or a few less people who take to drugs. The evidence from the release report is that, broadly speaking, there's no great change in prevalence. I go along with the view, which is that we take these things because we want them. The role that government has in regulating this market is almost nil. All that the effect of government intervention in the market is to increase the prison population. And also, very seriously, I call it inconvenience certain sections of society. On the whole, we do these things to ourselves because we want to. And the role of the government in dominating it is minimal. All these studies are interesting to that extent. I think it is a reasonable concern of government to reduce harm overall, but there's no evidence that government does reduce harm in this sector, so the government ought to get out of it.
Let me just have a look here. Right, I'm going to start at the back. I'm going to start at the very back and sort of work forward a bit. Short question, please.
Alan, because you mentioned earlier about politicians not wanting to confront the subject of drug decriminalisation or complete legalisation. I was wondering, how do you think you can get politicians to confront this subject, and if so, how?
Is there any chance at all? Who would like to go? Yes, that's some of you.
I mean, the most helpful thing you can do is take them abroad. They honestly think that the world stops at the Channel. And not just in this area, but in almost every area. And it's extraordinary. They travel before they become a politician, they stop then, they then travel again afterwards. But I think that what's happening in America is very exciting in these terms. We are learning, not just, one of the great dreads actually is not the consumption, because all their children consume drugs. Their dread is selling them. It's the idea of having shops on the street that sell drugs. I'm old enough to remember when betting shops came in. People absolutely couldn't believe that you'd have a shop in the high street selling gambling. It was appalling. 6 weeks later, betting shops are in place. If you go to Los Angeles, San Francisco now, you see these they've got all kinds of names. They're basically cannabis shops. Ditto in Holland. Once you got used to them, you got used to them. For what it's worth, I think that hard drugs ought to be on prescription, as they were before the Misuse of Drugs Act came in. These drugs were pretty well controlled then. It wouldn't be the same because there's so many of them now. But broadly speaking, most of these drugs have different categories and different classifications. But the problem is to get over the taboo, and the taboo is the problem.
Can I just add to that?
Yes.
I also think that politicians are moving on this because they're starting to look foolish. There's only so often that you can ignore a call for reform, and when that call includes groups like the Global Commission on Drug Policy, which has Kofi Annan on it, and various other high-profile figures, when you have the BMA coming out saying we need to have reform, when you have the Home Affairs Select Committee, the previous head of the Bar Council, the head of the Royal College of Physicians, and you keep saying, no, what we're doing is working, you start to look a little bit foolish. And I think that's why we've seen this week the Home Office saying that there will be at least a visit to other countries for a review, although it is worrying that they've started that with the decriminalisation is not an option we will consider no matter what we find with our review. But it's movement.
Drugs aren't going to be legalised in my lifetime at all. It's just not going to happen. It's almost pointless discussing it in a way. It's not going to happen. Just look what happened when cannabis was downgraded from Class B to Class C. There was outrage. People don't, in the main, people don't like the idea of people going around off their heads, and that's all there is to it. It's not a vote winner to legalise drugs, and also it's going in completely the opposite direction to all other policy. We're not moving towards legal drugs. We're moving to banning alcohol and tobacco, if anything. It's just not, unfortunately, going to happen. That we may possibly, if we have a minor revolution, we may possibly decriminalise cannabis in some form, but nothing else.
Well, Milton Friedman did say that economists are very bad predictors of what the gentleman there in the white has been trying to get in. Jeffrey.
I'm mixed race, but I'm not stigmatised for that. I'm not stigmatised for my sexuality, but I am stigmatised for the choices I make for the substances I use. Is drug use the last great stigma to be thrown out of Western society?
Yes. Any takers on that?
Yes,
Yeah.
the answer.
Good point.
I think I agree on that one. You agitating to speak for some time.
Yes, Jonathan Denby. The statistic that sticks in my mind is the fact that 25% of young black Americans are in jail, and mainly because of drugs. And yet we've got a black American president who's apparently, well, he was elected with 97% of the black votes, and he's meant to be liberal. So if we can't convert Obama, is there any hope?
I'll go for that one. You mean, I'm not sure, considering the way politics works in the States, you need to convert Obama in the first instance. I think the fact that the States have so much autonomy over what laws that they can bring into effect is really going to be the tipping point there. In terms of the impact on the black community in the US, I mean, there's an excellent book by a lady called Michelle Alexander called The New Jim Crow Law, which actually looks at the kind of insidious nature of drug laws used as a form of social control over the black community. And so just to put it into context, for many of you may know this, but in terms of sentencing for cocaine and crack in the US, up until last year, if you were caught with crack, which was a drug that was more prevalent within black communities of poverty, simply because of the poverty, because white people who were poor were using it as well, your sentence was 100 times more than those who were caught in possession of cocaine powder, which is a middle class, upper class white used drug generally. And also I mean, the big issue in the US is going to be the financial arguments. The prison industrial complex system there is huge and has huge lobbying influences. So I mean, I think in terms of the race issue, that needs to be, it's not just about drugs. It's about much more of a kind of insidious social control that we're seeing.
Just quickly add that Barack Obama, the current president, has admitted taking Class A drugs. His predecessor, George Bush, admitted taking Class A drugs. Our Prime Minister has admitted, I think, taking Class A drugs. Bill Clinton took Class B drugs. The prevalence of drug use amongst presidents and prime ministers is a lot higher than the general population, but it doesn't make any difference to drug policy.
Might explain a lot of things. Yeah, that's it.
Hi, Rory Vegan. A lot of people spend a heck of a lot of money buying little packets of white powder, obviously for a reason. With governments trying to direct us into the ways that they think are best, is the route to legalization some kind of study of the welfare maximizing rate of consumption?
You need economists.
I don't know.
We don't know.
I'm not an economist.
Oh, all right. Oh.
You get a better return off a gram of coke than you do off a Facebook share.
We don't know, Rory. Sorry. Gentleman right at the back. Give your name.
Stephen Wolf. Just a little question. It occurs to me that drugs are a product, and those who produce the product, obviously in any market economy, want to enhance their market share and ensure that their consumers stay with them. In your concept of legalization, do you take into consideration the drug producers who may tweak their product to ensure that you continually stay addicted to that, and that they ensure that they get greater market share? Because obviously the effects of being addicted are paid for by everybody else.
That's a question for a libertarian, right?
Well, that's really a question of regulation. I mean, we talk about free market. I mean, there are no free markets, so they're all regulated to some degree. I mean, I actually might be less of a legalizer than the other two. I don't know, but I mean, the proposition I put out in my book, The Art of Suppression, is actually that we don't legalise things like heroin and crack cocaine and crystal meth, although we would prescribe them to addicts, on the basis that these are drugs that were really created by Prohibition, that didn't really exist before Prohibition, and therefore I'm hoping and assuming that there isn't any real secular demand for them. And I would hope that we can maybe shift heroin addicts towards opium smoking. Maybe that's naive. Obviously I can't stop people making crack cocaine in the bathroom with or the kitchen with the cocaine, but I don't think we need to necessarily legalise those things. We are coming, you wouldn't start from here, would you? But we are, and so I think, yes, a little bit of regulation and a little bit of prohibition still in the early stages might be needed to try and shift things back after 100 years of a fiasco.
Sorry.
Yeah. Just quickly to add, I mean, addiction is a complicated thing. Just because a substance is available doesn't mean that someone becomes addicted to it. Most of the people that we see actually use problematically because of some deeper problem, whether that's a history of sexual abuse or some trauma. That not everyone, but the vast majority of problematic users, it's a much more entrenched problem, possible mental health problem. So I don't think necessarily an availability of a substance leads to addiction.
And what could you add to cocaine to make it more addictive anyway?
Well, you're bursting to get in on this. You've had one go, but very quickly.
On that point, the freer the market, the freer the user is to find the product that suits their needs. Yeah. If the market's over-controlled and there's only one or two suppliers, they might be supplying a product you don't want. But because you have a desire, you will fulfill your desire with a product that doesn't match your needs. If you have a completely free market with 100 suppliers, all providing something slightly different, those people with the genetic metabolism who want something mental will go for that. Some people who want something functional to get them past, I don't know, their politicians or other problems in our society will go for something much more mellow. The solution to the problem is a free market, not to a controlled one.
Yeah, we assume that a legalised market would look more or less the same as it does now, but just legal and through shops. There's no reason why you would buy cocaine in a gram wrap. It would be in products. It would be put into potions and who knows, chewing gum and whatever.
No, it wouldn't, because we've already seen when you have big organisations like Tesco's, they can't control their supply chain. When I was on the supply chain in South London, the supply chain is a flat somewhere in South London to the boys on the bikes that distribute product. The problem is when you've got massive organisations, there's no control. The market should be kept with small groups of people, often immigrant communities, ostracized, undereducated, underconformed, underinvolved, and allow them to have a market and provide to their customers. The drug dealer in Brixton is more likely to be selling to a city lawyer than a...
You started so sound and now you want to regulate these markets. Yeah.
I'd like some clarity from the panel about the availability over the counter of some very toxic substances like diamorphine, heroin. I mean, are you seriously proposing that these things that can often use in terminally ill people are used to end life are available over the counter? You can't be serious. Can we have some clarification, please? No,
it's a very fair question. I think anybody who studies these things abroad realises what an extraordinary variety of substances we're talking about. Cannabis in states in America is simply freely available. It's freely available in much of Europe. It's freely available in Britain. Getting very dangerous drugs is quite difficult. The problem at the moment is that getting very dangerous drugs is in a sense through the same market conduits as less dangerous drugs. In other words, the escalation is quite easy to achieve. I have to admit, I'm afraid I'm in favour of extreme regulation of drugs. I really do. Some of these things, including strong cannabis, is dangerous, particularly to teenagers. It's mind-altering. I want it controlled. I've seen what it does to young kids. I don't want it in the free market, which is more or less where it is now. They should be on, the things you're describing should be on prescription. I mean, they very well used to be on prescription. When they're on prescription, you can to a certain degree regulate them. There's always the danger of a black market if you get the price mechanism wrong or if you get the regulation mechanism wrong. But it makes sense that seriously dangerous things should be under regulation. They're not at the moment.
Alcohol, what would you say on that? That's pretty dangerous.
You can go into a shop and buy a litre of brandy. And God knows, it's totally lethal. Buy it over the counter. Most people, I emphasise most people, on the whole, are reasonably responsible. In the case of alcohol, we do treat people as being normal adults. I think we disagree here. I'm in favour of using the tax system to nudge people in certain directions. And I'd like to nudge them against consuming very large quantities of strong alcohol. And I've got no problem with using the price mechanism to do that. I wouldn't ban it.
Can I just add to that?
Yeah.
So just, I think Simon's absolutely right. We can't treat drugs as a homogenous group of items. They're not. And in terms of cannabis, it kind of comes back to Eamon's point about prohibition. I mean, sometimes what we see within the illegal market are stronger strains. There is no product control, no quality control, no control over the levels of THC within cannabis, or the CBD levels, which are the two main psychoactive substances. So strong regulation will provide for that. And in terms of, the other drugs, most of the club drugs, there's a few that are particularly harmful to people who use them, but most of the club drugs would be much safer if they were readily available through a designated, like the old off license, through a designated shop that has someone there who can give people advice on how to use the drug, how to consume it safely, test it, make sure that it doesn't have PMMA, for example, in ecstasy, which can kill people, that it does have high-level MDMA. With heroin, you would prescribe it. So there's lots. I would really recommend Transform's book, which is called Blueprint for Regulation, which outlines beautifully all the alternative models that have been proposed around this.
Yeah, it was mentioned earlier that drugs, that some cannabis was legalized in some US states like Alaska, I believe, in the 70s.
Decriminalized.
Decriminalized for what? Why was it recriminalized again, and how do we know that, historically, I have no idea, why was it recriminalized, and is there a, how do we know that the current wave isn't just some kind of false dawn?
Yeah, I'm just checking if Alaska's still there. Alaska's still decriminalised. So decriminalisation is just the application of non-criminal sanctions. So generally the police will issue a fine for possession offences. Pretty much all of the states, I'm not aware of one state that's pulled back on those laws. So if you are, that would be interesting. I've just checked, and Alaska's definitely not one. And medical marijuana as well. All of the states that have adopted medical marijuana, they have not moved back from those laws. It seems that once the change occurs, that the political argument around it dies quite quickly. And that's because this is not a politically divided debate. There are those from the right who support reform of drug laws and drug policy, and those from the left support it. So I think it becomes a kind of non-political football, if you like, once that happens. So I haven't seen any pullback. If you do know of some,
that's better than what I thought.
But don't underestimate. I think this is the point. Governments today want to regulate everything.
Yeah.
It'll never calm down. Every week now, it's obesity, it's cigarettes, whatever it may be. It's unwise to take these things, or we're taking too much of them. It's how do we control it, and it's the borderline between disapproving of something, educating people about something, publicising something, and controlling it that we find almost impossible to police. And I think we'll always be drifting back over into the taboo areas.
Okay, we've got, who feels a question welling up inside them? We've got two there, one there. All right, I'll take three very quick ones and quick answers. Starting there.
To Sir Simon. In 2001, I believe, the American government filed a patent for medicinal marijuana. Well, not medicinal marijuana. Medicine derived from marijuana. For example, Sativex is used in treating multiple sclerosis. Marinol was used as an appetite stimulant, predominantly during the AIDS epidemic. And the Israeli army used marijuana at present to treat PTSD. Do you stand by your submission that there's no legitimate usage for cannabis?
I don't think I said that. No, I totally accept your point. Clearly, for some people, it's very enjoyable, and some people it's medicinally effective.
Right, let's clear that one.
It has effects. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
All right, Cal Patterson. Given that politicians apparently are afraid of press reaction, why is it that the press can't campaign for drugs? Like the Evening Standard campaigns for other things successfully, apparently. Why not drugs?
You're the Standard author.
Well, I mean, most newspapers now are sort of on our side. The extraordinary phenomenon. I wish someone would do a study of most politicians think we're not.
Yeah.
I mean, the reason why I use the word taboo, and it's much used in drug circles, is taboo is irrational. There's an irrational relationship between the political mind and its perception of what public opinion, driven by the press, might think if they were to make a particular step in a particular direction. And I genuinely am baffled by it, because I've got I mean, most journalists talk like me. I mean, The Economist has been campaigning on this for decades to no effect. Most of the newspapers express reasonably open-minded points of view now about decriminalisation. It has absolutely no effect on government. And I genuinely think if you talk to a Home Office minister, which I usually have done over the years, they have a kind of a horror of even sort of mentioning it in the office. It's a genuinely taboo topic. And I think it has to do with the fact that these particular forms of addiction derive from sort of foreign countries. It's a foreign addiction. Alcohol's our addiction. You know, good British people get drunk. It's foreigners who get stoned. And it is this somehow transgresses the generations. We can't get over it.
Quick one.
Could I just add to the point on the, just
Yeah.
really quickly? Completely agree with what Simon says, and also too, the Sun and the Mirror last year carried out their own polls with their readership to say about what their views are on drug policy. Overwhelmingly, they supported review and at least experimentation with decriminalisation. The only sticking point, and it's not all newspapers, it's the Daily Mail. So anytime we've met with, I have met with so many politicians who've said to me, well, we agree completely with your position, but how do you sell it to the Daily Mail? And that's the real problem. And again, the polls are moving on the Daily Mail readership.
It's not just the Daily Mail, though. I mean, you might remember The Independent was very strongly in favour of decriminalising cannabis a few years ago, and then when it was downgraded to Class C, they brought into all this nonsense about how skunk is a completely different drug, and it's not the same thing we used to smoke in the 60s, and it's a good job it's banned. Newspapers much prefer moral panic and a scare than they do trying to spread liberalisation.
But I'm going to dissent with you now and say the politicians don't care about the Independent.
No human eye has ever trod. The front there, yep.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I had a question about applying the European example to the UK. I lived in the Netherlands for 4 years, and this is obviously all anecdotal, but it was clear to me that people that were visiting coffee shops in the Netherlands weren't the Dutch, they were British and German tourists coming to the Netherlands to smoke cannabis. So much so that the Netherlands last year changed their legislation so that cannabis can only be sold now to either Dutch nationals or people who live in the Netherlands. But either way, there was clearly an issue there, which was tourism for cannabis use. I just wondered whether, given how 24-hour drinking didn't really go down as we expected in the UK, how can we be certain that we won't have the same problems if we legalise something like cannabis in the UK? Is there something about the British psyche or British culture which means that we might not be quite as sensible as our European counterparts?
Well, I was in Amsterdam actually 3 weekends ago, and they didn't bring that law in. The mayor of Amsterdam very wisely realised that this was going to be a bad idea. So they've managed to keep the tourism industry afloat for the time being. But you are quite right that it is not mainly Dutch people who are smoking marijuana in coffee shops, but that's only because it's become the hub of drug use in Europe by virtue of being more or less the only place where you can legally smoke marijuana in a coffee shop. You can't assume that that's what would happen everywhere. On the, I'm not sure what you mean by 24-hour drinking not going as we expected. It was expected to lead to the last days of Rome. What's actually happened is alcohol consumption's declined by 16%. So I don't know how mature or immature we are. I don't want to be xenophobic about my own people, so I will assume that we could probably handle it.
I think actually there's a very interesting phenomenon. It's not just here, it's in financial regulation, any form of regulation. If you've got a market that's regulated for a long time, and then you suddenly deregulate, all hell breaks loose for a very short time, then a new reality is established. So, a very quick question, right at the back, you're in the corner there.
You're very quick. My name is Gabriela Moralejo. I am a foreigner. I do get drunk sometimes, and I do smoke a joint sometimes. Don't you think that we, people who are proactive about what we're talking about here, we are our worst enemy? Because we do feel the taboo, and even though we've been users in the past, or we are still users, we are the first one to be ashamed of saying that.
I'm not.
You're not, yeah, but you said that. There is a lot of people, I'm sure, in here that they are, and I think that is the first problem. That we shouldn't be ashamed of it, because there is no shame on that.
I'll take that as a comment rather than a question. I will. I have to wrap up the proceedings now. Had a very interesting discussion. Thank you very much indeed, and I certainly have learnt a lot. I think we probably all have. I would like to ask you to join us for a drink, alcohol, at the back before you make your way. But in the meantime, may I ask you to thank our speakers, Chris Snowdon, Niamh Eastwood, and Sir Simon Jenkins, for a very stimulating evening. Thank you very much indeed. Church and state, but there's also an advertisement.
So Jonathan mentioned the politicians who'd admitted to their drug use. So we produced sorry, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. We produced a pack of playing cards with all of the politicians who've admitted to drug use, what they said. If you're interested, go on the website and support it. It pays for it.
Thank you very much.